So welcome everyone to this webinar, which will be focused around the ongoing issues being faced by both landlords and tenants in the current climate. Since the start of the pandemic, we've seen the introduction of legislation through the Coronavirus Act, which has had and continues to have a major impact on the rental market. The legislation is ever changing, and understandably, it can be very difficult for those parties to a tenancy agreement to know exactly what their rights are when problems first arise. Landlords and tenants have faced differing issues throughout the pandemic, from reduction in income through furlough or loss of employment, and therefore an inability to meet their obligations under the tenancy agreement, to shielding recommendations which may prevent contractors or others entering the property when required. In order to address some of these concerns in more detail, along with the options available to both parties, we've gathered a group of industry experts together to give their thoughts and opinions on the most common subjects we've seen arising over the last 12 months. My name's Heather Wilmot. I'm the BTE Claims Manager here at ARAG. So what I'd like to do now is just go round the team and ask everybody to introduce themselves and just give a little bit of information as to their roles. So Carly, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, of course. I'm co-director of Paula at Woodstock Legal Services. We are a law firm, and we have a large team that specialise, as do Paula and myself, in residential landlord and tenant law. So we do possession proceedings, working with agents, training, documents, and lots of debt recovery, disrepair claims. And I tend to head up the debt recovery team.
Fantastic. Paula, can we go to you?
Yep, I'm Paula and I'm a solicitor and co-director. I head up the possession team, so we're dealing with a lot of evictions at the moment and tricky cases keeping us on our toes.
Mm-hmm. Great. Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Drummore and I'm a barrister at Land Chambers, and I specialise in residential and commercial landlord and tenant law, and I'm glad to be with you today.
Justin.
Hello, I'm Justin Bates. I'm a barrister at Landmark Chambers. I'm the editor of the Encyclopedia of Housing Law, and despite what it may look like on your screen, I am not wearing sunglasses. This is just what's happened to my glasses. I've tried taking them off, but then I can't see my screen, so I'm afraid this is we're going to have to leave these on for a bit.
Absolutely fine, no problem at all. And lastly, David, can we come to you?
I can't compete with that. Justin, you look like a DJ about to do a set. Hi everyone, I'm David Votter. I'm the owner of Votter Sales and Lettings. We're a Kent-based estate agency and I specialise in residential lettings. I'm also Vice President of Arla Property Mart, the UK's foremost professional body for regulated agents.
Okay, thanks everybody. I think the first question that we want to cover will be directed to you, Justin. And that's, what challenges are tenants facing at the moment?
So I think there are probably three main categories of problems that are going to be affecting tenants in the PRS at the moment. The first and most obviously is rent arrears. We don't really know how many tenants are in rent arrears or to what level. There was a report out about a month ago from the Communities and Local Government Select Committee, which said that it was somewhere between 800,000 people in arrears and 500,000 people in arrears. The 800,000 arrears comes from the NRLA, and the 500,000 figure comes from the CAB. In terms of value, the Select Committee thinks that we probably need somewhere in the region of 200 to 300 million of government support to get landlords and tenants through these arrears problems. So assuming that the Select Committee are anticipating some kind of rent reductions and rent discussions, etc., we're looking at well over £300 million worth of arrears for somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 people. The second problem, I think, is overcrowding, which might seem a slightly odd thing to say, but you hopefully all saw over the weekend the report that was published by the National Housing Survey, which showed that 1 in 7 private renters are now overcrowded, up from about 1 in 15 before the pandemic. So you can see what's happened is people have left properties they couldn't afford, or they've left to go and look after elderly relatives, other relatives, and they've stayed where they are. So we're looking at overcrowding in the PRS. And then the third problem is that it's difficult at the moment because of lockdown and because of restrictions on face-to-face meetings, etc., for tenants to get any advice. There's a real shortage of access to legal advice and welfare benefits advice. And given the number of people who suddenly find themselves having to claim benefits, again, you might all have seen that there were, I think, 1.2 million new claims for universal credit during the pandemic. Not being able to access advice means that you don't know the full extent of the options available to you. So I think those are the three sort of most immediate problems there. I mean, there are going to be problems in the long term. The impact of the arrears crisis on tenants is going to be felt for years to come as people's credit records get destroyed, as savings get eaten into, etc. But for today, I think those are the three areas that I imagine most people looking at this webinar are going to be concerned about: arrears, overcrowding, and then how best to help their tenant get the assistance they need.
Okay, thanks, Justin. That's really interesting. Just to clarify, when you're talking about the PRS, just for those that on the call that may not know what that relates to.
Oh, the private rented sector, because no phone call no call at all would be complete without an impenetrable acronym. So that's my contribution to it. PRS, private rented sector.
Fantastic, thank you. And just to keep things fair and balanced out, David, what challenges are landlords facing at this time?
Absolute decimation. I mean, it's an interesting one because I am the servant of two masters, so landlords and tenants. I've got a duty of care to my tenants to make sure they're safe, their well-being's good, they're looked after, and I've got a contractual obligation to my landlord to make sure I'm abiding by my contract and taking care of business, basically. So there's this perception that all landlords across the country are wealthy, they've got loads of money, they've got a bottomless pit to dip into, they go round, at the weekend with, on their horses hunting foxes and all this weird perception, when the reality is quite different. And I'll give you an example of this. So about a year ago, probably longer, a landlord had this tenant in London. He had this property in London. He took a job over in New York, really good job. The tenant went into arrears before COVID hit, and he was remotely managing it. He didn't have a managing agent, but regardless of that, the tenant wasn't paying. Now, this landlord lost his job out in New York and needed to return to the UK to move back into his property. Now, it's a two-pronged attack. So with the landlord, he's lost his job, right? So he's in trouble financially. His tenant's also failing to pay. So he's got no income there. So he can't pay the mortgage on his rental property either. So this landlord faces repossession. He could lose his property. He could lose everything. And this is the conflict we have between landlords and tenants, because the way the judicial system works, and Paul will probably tell me to get off my high horse quite a lot, but there's tenants that can walk away from owing 12, 18 months, 2 years worth of rent scot-free. There's no real comeuppance because they could disappear. Whereas a landlord losing all of that money would financially cripple them, because we're looking at mortgages. So the challenges facing landlords is, one, getting possession of their property, two, surviving on income, because let's face it, COVID's ruined a lot of people and there's a lot of people without money. And, three, there's like the stress of the situation, getting to court, the court possession. And if a landlord hasn't used a proper, I'm not plugging myself, by the way, but if a landlord hasn't used a proper regulated agent to set that tenancy up, Paula and I both know we've had to intervene in situations where landlords haven't set the tenancy up, properly, because they haven't served the right bits and pieces. It doesn't make them a rogue, doesn't make them a bad landlord, it just makes them inexperienced, So I do empathise with tenants in their situations, but I feel the real landlords, the real victims here are the landlords, because it's a double-pronged attack.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Now we've addressed the issues that are being faced by both the tenants and landlords at this time. Paula, if we could start with you. If you're a landlord and you're having a problem with your tenant, what early legal interventions are available for those landlords?
It's really interesting hearing both sides with Justin and David. And what I am hearing is that you need to communicate with your tenant. So a landlord needs to speak to their tenant, and the tenant, it's really important that they approach the agent and the landlord and say, look, I'm struggling here. I've been furloughed. I've lost my job. Please, can we try and find a solution? So we have been working really hard with landlords and letting agents to try and help them. And some of the solutions are a rent reduction. Now, with a rent reduction, it doesn't have to be permanent. I say to landlords, review it every month. Look at your own finances. So don't be too generous if you think, oh, it's going to get me into trouble with paying my mortgage. And make sure you record it. So any agreement that you have with the tenant, put it in writing, because we have situations where a landlord will come to us and say, oh, they haven't paid the rent and I agreed a reduction. Well, on what terms? You know, is it the position that the tenant thinks you're not going to want to recover that rent? Well, no, I said to him. So there's no actual, you know, written agreement. Even if it's an email and the tenant emails back saying, yes, this is what's agreed, just keep that paper trail. Now, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a lot of tenants who just went into panic, which was you know, naturally going to happen. We had tenants overseas, they couldn't get back to England. So one of the options is considering a surrender. So if a tenant doesn't want to go back to the property or can't afford the rent anymore, sometimes it's better to just cut your losses. So you can agree a surrender, which basically means bringing the tenancy to an end. You don't have to put it in writing, because we deal with a lot of cases where it's really hard to get a tenant to sign a legal document. But if you say to the tenant, look, a surrender is you're handing back possession, I'm taking back possession, that's the end of it. So I'd strongly consider that if you've got a situation where the tenant won't be able to afford the rent, and just get it relet to another tenant. At the moment, the courts are expecting parties to communicate and try and find solutions. You know, Justin has said the figures, it's scary. There's a lot of arrears out there. You need to be working with the tenants. A lot of cases are getting adjourned to give tenants opportunities. They're entitled to defend right at the hearing. So always look at the bigger picture. So, you know, you might think at the moment, oh no, I really begrudge as a landlord having to agree a rent reduction. Well, if I said to that landlord, it's going to take you at least 6 months to get that property back and will cost you a lot of money, then you might think differently. The other theme that we're seeing is because tenants aren't paying their rent in full, landlords will sometimes think that that prevents them having to comply with their repairing obligations. It doesn't. They need to get the repairs done. It's frustrating, but all you're doing is adding fuel to the fire. That tenant will get legal aid and defend your claim. It will cost you money. So be squeaky clean, get all the repair work done, and continue to communicate with the tenant. So in summary, you can agree what you like with the tenant, but make sure it's recorded. It could be a rent-free period, it could be a rent reduction, the tenant could pay it back over a period of time. You can agree a surrender. You could also serve a possession notice and agree settlement separately. So that's ticking away in the background. So if all fails, then yes, you can go to court. But the key thing is to communicate and be reasonable. It's not a time to fall out with each other. A lot of people are in the same boat, so you may not find a better tenant. And that's, you know, that's really what I would like to encourage landlords to think about.
When would you say then, Paula, is the best opportunity to open those lines of communication? Should it be taking place prior to any potential issues arising?
Definitely. So I know a lot of landlords, I mean, it's been over 12 months now, who spoke to their tenants right at the start of the pandemic and said, look, you need to talk to me if there are any issues so we can work together. So right at the beginning, as soon as there's a sniff of a problem, talk to the tenant, or even before. If you know what your tenant's job is and you think, right, bound to be hit by the pandemic, pick up the phone. It's not harassment. It's harassment if you're screaming at them, turning up at their door and demanding that they pay the rent. So do it as soon as possible. You know, just keep that human level.
Okay, thanks, Paula. That's really interesting. Can we move over to you next, David?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I completely agree with Paula with that. That's exactly what you have to do. And the trouble is, people have got to want to communicate as well. I mean, that is the ideal situation. However, you'll have situations where the tenant doesn't want to talk to the landlord. Like Paula said, the landlord wants to hammer them continuously, pay your rent, pay your rent. You know, you're going down the route of the Protection from Harassment Act. So it's really quite, you know, you've got to be very clear and, you know, just maintain that dialogue and just be in it together and in it for each other. You know, if the landlord is self-managing, then obviously they've got to keep that relationship. And us as a managing agent will be the facilitator. So we try and avoid landlord and tenant falling out and saying things that they don't like, because we might get an email from a landlord that says, right, David, tell those tenants they're absolute idiots. How can they sleep at night not paying this, and yada, yada, yada. We have to then temper that and go back and say, look, the landlord really, you know, would like to work with you on this. You know, he's struggling financially as everyone. Can we work together? And you have to really pacify that situation, really. But I just, yeah, just what Paula said in exactly hits the nail on the head.
Okay, thanks, David. Carly, have you got anything further to add in respect to that?
I would just second that, just to emphasise that it's really important. I think landlords do protect their position. So, like Paula mentioned, just making sure that if a notice can be served, that it is, because unfortunately it does take a long time to get through the court process. So, and I think it's really important that you understand that those two can be done hand in hand if they're done the right way. I mean, the letter we send out when we serve notice is not an aggressive letter. It's this is, you know, we're doing this to protect our position, but talk to us. And I think, you know, the people that are tending to fall into arrears when they wouldn't ordinarily have fallen into arrears, you know, because of the pandemic, are people that are, in the main, I think, more motivated to come to a solution and to talk. And I think as a result, and, you know, it does follow into debt recovery, we're having much more success in talking to people and getting them, you know, they want to get at, they're responding much more readily. Throw them a lifeline. They do actually want to, you know, they can sleep better at night if they know that there's a solution. So it's, you know, they'll just re-emphasize the approach that, you know, they've both said to take. And yes, I think, you know, just alluding to, you know, what happens in debt recovery, we're seeing by the time the claims come to us, unfortunately, they're much bigger. And whilst, you know, they've obviously put legislation in place to slow things down, unfortunately, a lot of tenants are burying their head in the sand as a result because they think that's okay. But actually, the problem they get right at the end, which they will get to, is a bigger problem. So, you know, just making that really clear to them, like, communicate now, let's resolve it now. Don't, you know, push the can down the road, because you just have a bigger problem there. And yeah, disrepair, you know, like Paula said, really important that landlords remember that this is their asset, but they have an obligation, you know, in letting out that property. It's the tenant's home, you know, and that needs to be remembered, and they have certain protections, and just keeping that mindset and sort of getting landlords, particularly the one, David, you know, I've got lots of examples like that where they've left their home because they've had to for various reasons and have let it out, and they kind of have to detach themselves from it being their home because it becomes very personal, and it's an asset. It's, you know, they've done it for financial reasons, and detach themselves a little bit from that so that they can think much more commercially, and remember that they still have to comply with their obligations for repair, despite the troubles they may be having with their tenant, because again, the problem will just escalate. And we are seeing a lot more disrepair defences coming in, huge amounts more, I would say. And in the main, a lot of them are very minor, but they, you know, delay things for you, they increase your costs. So it's just better to avoid it, and use your agent as well. And David hasn't paid me to say this, but having a good agent is really important, because it helps you. You know, I can imagine David gets very stressed emails from both sides, and, you know, a good agent will be able to take that stressed email from a landlord and put it in the right legal context so that it's received better by a tenant, and, you know, probably vice versa. So it's really important, and that you've got a good agent that's on top of everything for you. And you kind of can, you know, for landlords to kind of, like I say, just detach themselves from it, look at it more of an asset. I've employed a good agent, kind of release the emotion from it a little bit, and I think you can come to a much more pragmatic commercial solution that way.
Sure. And Paula, just quickly back to you. If the tenant does agree to a surrender rent reduction or something along those lines, what are the implications for them? Will they have adverse credit ratings as a result of there being arrears and them not being paid back, or will any agreement wipe those out in effect?
So it's whatever the agreement says. So at the moment, we'll see situations where the landlord may agree to just keep the deposit and write off the arrears. The agreement that you make is final. So if a landlord turns around and says, no, I'm happy to write off all the arrears, I just want my property back, I explain to the landlord, look, are you sure? You won't be able to recover that debt later on. So this is full and final. That's the end of it. Both parties walk away. And the landlord will normally say yes, because they're just so desperate to get the house back. So it's what is ever agreed with the tenant. And that it's really important that they think about that when they're agreeing the terms. But it's left for them to decide. So you may say to the tenant, you need to pay some of the arrears back. The reality is they don't. The reality is you cut your losses, get the property back, and move on, because you have to ask yourself, why is the tenant not paying? And the other thing I should have probably touched on is mental health. So at the moment, we're obviously seeing quite a lot of that on the increase. Tenants in tricky situations. So I'm saying to landlords, work with, social services. I've got one at the moment where the tenant needs some help. So I said, we can't go to court. It's a very protracted process if a tenant hasn't got capacity. So they're working with, there's a doctor, social services, to try and get the tenant rehoused somewhere suitable. And on that point, it's worth the tenant looking into what benefits they can claim. So you'll presume that a tenant knows all of this, and they don't. So a lot of tenants won't realise they're entitled to universal credit, even to the extremes at the moment, where tenants might not be aware that there's a food bank around the corner. So it's really important that landlords point out all of these, this help that's available at the moment to them, and just work together.
Right, Elizabeth, I'd like to move on to you if possible. So if the issues that have been experienced between the landlord and tenant can't be resolved at that earlier stage, and the dispute ends up going to court, what are the options available? But also, what is the situation if, for example, the landlord has refused to cooperate? So they have they can't detach themselves from it. It's got very personal. They don't want to accept less rent, for example, and they've refused any sort of ADR at an earlier stage. What are the implications for them in not going down that route?
Well, one of the requirements under the new arrangements for possession proceedings are that the court expects parties to at least engage and cooperate, and especially landlords. I think they've been asked to go the extra mile, as both David and Paula have outlined, really, in terms of communicating and proactively communicating with their tenants, just to see what effects coronavirus has had on their tenants before seeking possession proceedings. So if claims have been stayed, parties have been required to survey something called a reactivation notice. And as part of that, you have to explain to the court what effects coronavirus has had. So I think if a landlord simply says, well, I haven't bothered asking, I couldn't care less, that's not really going to put you in your best light before the court. The court wants to see that in circumstances where this pandemic really has had difficulties in terms of people either retaining their employment or having to face cuts in their income, that there's been some level of understanding on the part of landlords. So I wouldn't recommend in any way, shape or form landlords simply just being stubborn, although I can understand that obviously they've also been impacted. I think trying to be understanding and trying to show a level of reasonableness is something that the courts would appreciate all round, really. So that engagement that Paula mentioned from the outset, and David also, is really key. It's really key. In terms of if nothing works and really possession proceedings is the last avenue, well, I think what Justin said is true. It's the numbers facing possession proceedings potentially are enormous on a court system that's quite frankly creaking at the edges because of historic cuts in terms of budgets, but also just reduced services. I mean, the way that they've responded in terms of remote hearings has been incredible, but there are delays. And that's the reality of the situation. Paula mentioned roughly 6-month delays. I think it potentially could be longer than that, to be honest. I'm now having possession matters relisted, but with substantive final hearing dates almost to the end of the year, beginning of next year. That's incredible. That's a long period of time for a landlord who's experiencing difficulties with tenants paying. So I think there has to be that level of realism in terms of how long the process is taking. And that's also for what's historically been known as the faster Section 21 procedure, which is where there's a no-fault claim for possession, really, and the landlord just really wants their property back. I mean, the notice periods for that kind of procedure for obtaining possession is 6 months minimum. And that, quite frankly, is really, really long for some landlords. And it's just not a possibility to wait that period of time. But that's the reality of going to court at the moment.
I completely agree with all of that. The court system wasn't particularly responsive to the needs of parties prior to the pandemic, and it's certainly not going to get any better with the scale of the backlog. There's one, I think, quite interesting development kicked off in February, and it's just beginning to come online now. There's a free mediation service that the court service is offering with possession claims. The government sort of rushed the procurement of this service through, as the government likes to do. And I haven't been involved in any myself yet, but I saw the guidance for it published about 3 weeks ago. It's free to use, which is good. If the parties are willing to use it, then a mediator from, I think, the Society of Mediators, the trade body for mediators, will be in touch with you within 10 days of agreeing to do it, and they'll look to have a telephone mediation a few days after that. Now, obviously, mediation won't always lead to success. If the landlord needs the property back because he wants to live there, it's hard to see how you're going to mediate that successfully. If, on the other hand, as most of them are, it's about money, then the mediation may well be a much, much better result than spending time and money with lawyers and in a court system that isn't really cut out for it. I think for the next year, certainly, my advice to everyone is going to be think as much as you can about options that don't involve going to court, because the court service is not going to be in a position to deal with the backlog that's inevitable at the moment.
If I may jump in there, Heather, I couldn't agree more with Justin. I've had one experience of the mediation part.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was surprised, I must admit, just actually how easy it was for the litigants to navigate. So they understood the process and they were looking for a holistic approach, and it really wasn't as confrontational or adversarial as I thought it might be. And so I was pleasantly surprised, actually, where there were two willing parties who had taken stock and were willing just to try and understand each other's position, to try and come to some kind of agreement. I agree with Justin. I don't think it will work in all circumstances. I think it probably requires a little bit more funding on the part of the government, really, if they want to roll it out across the board and have real tangible effects from it. But I think as a first step, it's not bad. It's not bad.
Okay, so I guess what we're saying is that even if the early intervention doesn't necessarily work, there is opportunity at all stages to try and mediate between the parties in order to resolve the dispute before it reaches a final court hearing. So, court cases taken place, possession order is obtained, and there is arrears that need to be resolved. What are the options, Carly, for recovering those arrears?
Again, we're going back to communication, because I think a lot of the time the reality of it's very, very rare that all of the arrears, I'm saying very, very rare, it does happen, that are just cleared in full, because most of the time they just don't have the ability to do that. So it's unrealistic for a landlord to expect that I've got my money judgment. You know, they're going to just hand over the cash. They've just been holding on to it. It does happen, and there are situations, you know, and you hear of it, that people have just decided to hold back the rent because they, you know, misunderstood what the position was, or, you know, or just thought they could. It does happen, but in most cases they just physically couldn't pay it, so the money isn't there. So landlords need to be really realistic, and it's about the long term, and what they can do to look to recover it over a longer period of time. We're seeing much more by way of settlements, so communicating with tenants saying, look, we've got possession now, we've got this judgment, you don't want it to affect your credit rating, let's see what we can do to get it resolved. And we really are getting, you know, throwing people a lifeline. I had a tenant say to one of our solicitors this week, just thanking her for the help she'd done, because she said, I've actually been able to sleep at night because of the ability you've given me to address this and pay it back. Because, you know, most people don't want this hanging over their heads if you can give them a way to resolve it. There are lots of options, but so the one we will always start with is trying to do it by agreement. You know, what can you pay? How can you pay it back? You know, give us some timescales, and we'll see if that's acceptable to the landlord before going down the next route. If we can't do that, and we will do, you know, same with the possession proceedings, we will do that at every stage and revisit it. But if you can't do that, it's really important that you gain as much information as you can about your tenant's financial situation. You also quite often need to trace them to find out actually where they are before you can take any further steps. So, and that takes time. You know, people may not be moving to secure accommodation immediately. They may be staying with somebody else for a period of time. So, you know, that takes time, but we do lots of tracing, so asset trace, we'll ask them information, and then yeah, there's different tools that you can use. Attachment to earnings orders we use quite regularly, and that's, again, we just have to manage landlords' expectations that it's not getting the whole lump sum back, but you will get a fair proportion back on a, you know, on a monthly basis directly from their pay packet, essentially, putting it really simply. Sometimes those run for a period of time, but they may change employment, so you have to revisit. We use writs of control fairly regularly. I think, again, it's managing people's expectations. It's really, really rare that the High Court enforcement officers will actually go in and seize goods, because, you know, it's more hassle than it's worth. And actually, sometimes it's just that of having somebody attend the property. Obviously, they can't go in at the moment, attend the property, and again say, look, you owe this money. You know, what are your proposals to repay? If you want, you know, if you don't want us to come back again, you know, you need to look at it and you need to address it. We try and do as much as we can before we get to that stage, because actually the amount they owe by the time you've instructed the High Court enforcement officer is bigger, because you've got their costs on top. So we would much rather deal with it before that. And we are having, you know, success of saying, look, unfortunately, this is our next step if you don't communicate with us. And, you know, we contact tenants on, you know, on that basis. The other thing we do now and again is charging orders. That's very rare against an actual tenant, but where they've got a guarantor in place, and we've successfully obtained judgment against the guarantor. And, you know, my advice to landlords would be always, you know, seek to obtain a guarantor that owns property. Because you then have that tangible asset to go after. A guarantor, you know, for their, you know, by their very nature, are people that, you know, are financially more stable in theory, you know, and are likely, you know, I'd always push for them to be property owners as well, because I think it gives you that extra tool, basically. But, you know, yeah, I just would say there are many options, but it's information gathering, and again, it's communication. But we, you know, we're seeing really good results of communicating with people. I think it's really important that you gather that information as you go as well. And, you know, the big concern for me is that actually the court delays, whilst they're put in place, you know, in the extended notice periods, all of this are put in place to support tenants. I actually think they're coming out of a much bigger problem at the end. And landlords have got a long time to enforce that. They don't, you know, it's not, you know, it goes away after a year, it's still there. And actually there's action they can take, and it may be that they can't recover it in the first year, 2 years, but they can revisit it. And, you know, we will always say to landlords, you know, revisit, see if you can negotiate payment of a small amount now, revisit in 6 months' time, can they increase their payments? It's a long game, basically.
And I guess as well, then there's benefit in having the conversations with those potential outcomes with the landlord, again, at that earlier stage, so that they're aware that even if you do obtain a money judgment, you're not necessarily going to see any of it, but also you might not see a lump sum. It will again be an agreement over a set period of time. So you could always try and enter into those negotiations and agree something similar prior to actually having to go to court.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, there are times when that can work. There are times when landlords, you know, think out of principle, that's, you know, money that's should be in my pocket and not theirs. And I don't care how long it takes, but it should be repaid, which is, you know, mental. I do understand, you know, and if you're prepared to give people the time to you know, to do that and achieve that, then that's, you know, fairness restored in theory. But yeah, those conversations should be had at the very start and should be continued throughout early intervention, possession, and then when you're enforcing and recovering. So yeah.
Then what lessons can the landlords and the tenants themselves learn from all of these procedures? Paula, can I direct that to you first of all?
So as I keep banging on about, communication is key. So please talk to each other. We seem to have lost that ability to just talk. Everything's text message, email, WhatsApp. Pick up the phone, arrange a meeting and speak to tenants, meet them. I mean, David, I think, meets all the new tenants to suss them out. And I know quite a lot of agents that do that. I think, well, there's going to be more CCJs. I think it's going to be more common now with referencing. So look at other options. Is there a possibility of having a guarantor? So a third party, I always call it the bank of mum and dad, who might be able to step in if the tenant defaults. And also make sure that the property's let in really good condition. So, and maintain it. Keep a paper trail, do a really good inventory, make sure the tenant agrees the inventory, because we are seeing a lot more disrepair claims. We're having cases that have been reactivated since the lockdown, over a year old. They're obtaining legal aid and they're defending. So make sure you keep a good paper trail of any issues that the tenant reports and let it in a good condition and have a good inventory. And also a good letting agent like David. I am going to plug him here because he is excellent. So make sure the deposit's protected properly. How to rent guide, energy performance certificate, electrical safety. It goes on and on and on. Don't be, you know, a landlord, DIY landlord, if you don't know what you're doing. There is a lot of legal to it now. So either learn, go on courses. There's lots of associations out there that can support landlords, or get a good letting agent, because it's all good when it's going well, but when it's not, as we know, it all goes horribly wrong. And then you may find yourself stuck in this horrible court process.
And what are the implications then of those gas safe certificates, etc., not being done correctly at an early stage?
That's a really good question. Potentially, you can't serve a valid Section 21 notice. There's been lots of cases on it, and if you haven't actually bothered to do one, it's a big problem. You potentially will find it very difficult to get your property back, or you will potentially be a test case. So you need to make sure the paperwork's in place to be able to serve a valid possession notice. I have landlords that come to me and say, and I understand, I want the property back now. And I'll say, well, you have to give 6 months notice. Are there any other reasons? No, I just want it back. I don't know. He's causing me a bit of a headache. Have you served a how to rent guide? What's the how to rent guide? Have you served the correct edition? It goes on and on. Have you got an energy performance certificate, gas safety certificate? Have you undertaken one every year? And we have to try and help them recover their property when it's been poorly managed. Nice people, just very naive to the system. And there's no excuse. If you go to court and you say to the judge, I didn't bother to do a gas safety, they will not be happy. Gas is serious. You've got to get that right. So, so my advice is, if you don't know what you're doing, use a good letting agent. You know, make life easier for yourself. And if they get it wrong, sorry, David, you can sue your agent for negligence.
And in terms of the notices then, Paula, obviously they've extended the time up to 6 months currently. What are the issues if they are served incorrectly and maybe not identified at an early stage as being served incorrectly?
Very, very upset landlords. Well, we always have to provide them with the bad news, the fun part of the job. Yeah, they have to start again. So we have landlords that come to us, they've issued court proceedings, and we check the notice, and it's fundamentally wrong. So we have to discontinue the claim, hope that the tenants don't pursue their costs against the landlord, and start all over again, which will mean sorting out all the paperwork, so the gas safety, how to rent, etc., then serving 6 months notice, then back to court. So it's really important you get it right at the start.
Thanks, Paula. David, have you got anything further to add there?
There's one thing I often say to a lot of landlords that come to me with issues, and ignorance isn't an excuse in the eyes of the law. And Paula hit the nail on there. You don't have to be a bad landlord to get it wrong. But I mean, we are seeing a mass exodus of landlords, and as a letting agent, we see it a lot. So they introduced various bits of legislation, and tenant fee ban was one that was a real pain in the backside. Not because I'm an agent and we couldn't charge admin fees, but the ripple effects surrounding that. So obviously they cap deposits at 5 weeks. So we've got landlords now that will just say, I don't want to take a pet because I can't take a high deposit. And then they're bringing out Let's with Pets, you know, the government approved tenancy agreement, which, you know, not hardly anyone's going to use, really, to be honest with you. And then you've got the Tenant Fees Act, which meant that agents now have to charge landlords that third of the lost income that they lost, which, you know, to be honest with you, it was overcooked. They were charging too much. My philosophy, and when I wrote to Alok Sharma, the housing minister that was in office for probably a couple of days, I don't know, was that they should cap the tenant fees an amount that's relevant to that tenant. So, for example, like you would tax. But again, that was overlooked. So inadvertently, those rents are now at skyrocket amount, and it's becoming inaffordable. So what you've got is the mass exodus of landlords, meaning that there's not that many properties available in the market, and we've got huge amounts of tenants. I mean, we have to do block viewings now on a Saturday with 10 to 15 tenants with allocated slots because the demand is there, and we're in a situation where we put a property on the market, we get so much traction, and we've got service level where we get back to everybody. We don't ignore anyone, whether on benefits or not. You know, whoever they are, we'll get back to them. But we now have to put that property on, then remove it from the market because we can't deal with all the inquiries. There's too many for us. So, and then we get the tenants that are viewing that weekend saying, oh, the property's not on the market. What's going on? We said, look, due to the overwhelming response, we've had to take it off. But, you know, what I would say to landlords going forward is rent guarantee and legal cover, you know, for the cost of the Chinese takeaway every month. Why would you not protect your most valuable asset? And that's one thing, just to set that tenancy up right, because like Paula said, how to rent, guys, you know, gas safety certificates, all these things you need to get possession, people are forgetting and thinking, oh, well, I didn't realise I had to do that. Well, then you need an agent, or you need to get yourself on courses. A detailed communication log, which is another thing Paula said. We have a CRM and we document everything. Every conversation we have, we copy and paste the email, we put it in its date stamp. So if Paula said to me, David, we're going to get possession, we're going to court in June, send me everything you've got. I say, do you really want everything? Because there's pages and pages of evidence. So you need that. Also, from a tenant perspective, income protection. I mean, why would you not get income protection? And it's a lot of tenants say, well, you know, I haven't really got anything of value, you know, or anything like that. But on the same token, if you are unable to work, you need to pay for the roof that's over your head. And also, we want tenants to understand that a lot of landlords will work with them. And if a tenant decides, or not decides, is forced into a situation where they can't pay rent, when that tenant vacates that premises or gets evicted or whatever, and they have to rent through a reputable agent, again, they're going to struggle, you know. And that's why a lot of tenants will go to the likes of Gumtree and Open Rent and the newspaper to find their next landlord. And that landlord is advertising, I mean, this is a generalised statement, I'm not talking every landlord, but landlords will advertise in certain areas because they want to go under the legislation and not get caught. So then that tenant will then end up in a worse situation with a worse property. So again, it's all about communication. You move into that property, let people know. And we've had a few during COVID where they haven't said anything. We've contacted them and said, "What, are you okay? What's going on? Talk to us." And then there's others that said, "Look, David, we're really struggling. Could we do a part payment?" We go back to the landlord. Do you know what? Because you've been great tenants, we'll work with you and we will help you. And that's what we do. And surprise, surprise, those accounts are now up to date. But the ones that don't want to help themselves, that bury their head in the sand, that think the landlord will pick this up, because they're financially better off than I am, are the ones where it goes horribly wrong. No one wants to go to court. No one wants the anxiety of going, "I've got a court order. I'm going to face eviction. I'm going to have a money judgment order. I'm going to have, attachment of earnings. I've got to pay this debt, a CCJ." It's just not a comfortable place to be. And I think the government has failed us. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this, by the way, but the government has failed us all miserably in the way that the legislation in place is not fit for purpose. And we talk about a no-fault eviction, Section 21. I mean, what landlord evicts a good tenant for no reason? A lot of it is due to rent arrears, there being problematic tenants, or the landlord has to move back in financially or move a family member. This whole perception of, when Shelter are saying about no-fault evictions, tenants are being served no-fault evictions, there's always a reason. There's never not a reason. So we're talking about the Renters Reform Bill, but, abolishing Section 21. They've got to have a robust system in place to counteract that.
No, thanks, David. That was really interesting. Justin, have you got any thoughts about the lessons that can be learned by both the landlords and tenants?
No, I'm just going to reply to David for a minute. The problem with it you're describing, though, David, stems from the fact that we have a fundamentally unsophisticated private rented sector in this country. The average portfolio size is 2.1 units. And so I know all this from the work we did on the Right to Rent Judicial Review, where I was representing the NRLA. We have a fundamentally amateurish private rented sector. It's because people have become landlords not because they have a desperate desire to own property based on some misguided love of monopoly games. It's because there's no other way of making a return. It's because people have got properties that they bought when they bought their first flat and then they've got married and they've moved out somewhere, or it's they've got their money from their pension or from their redundancy or whatever, and nothing else gets a yield of 6-7%. We use property in this country as a proxy means of supporting the incomes of a certain class of society. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing, I don't know. That's a political question, not a legal question. But the problem is that when you've got landlords who treat landlordism as income stream, and who, because their portfolios are quite small, don't have the time or the inclination to read up on what's around it, what happens is you get the kind of problems that you're describing. I mean, the idea that a landlord might have to carry a rent arrears for a period of time doesn't strike me as particularly revolutionary. You're running a business. There'll be times when you don't get paid. There are shock horror people who haven't paid me. There are shock horror people who haven't paid you. Running a business means running with a degree of loss. The problem is where you're using that, where you've only got one property and where that property's income is your pension, you've got no scope for loss. And that's the bigger question you need to grapple with. It's not around whether or not you have no-fault evictions or such like. No-fault eviction is a symptom of the fact that we have too much, in some parts of the country, we have too much demand for housing and not enough supply. It's a symptom of the fact that until relatively recently, rents increased without any regard to the wider inflation, because what was increasing was an asset, not by reference to what people could actually afford. I mean, we have housing makes me, it pays my bills. It is my living, and I find it fundamentally fascinating. But we have an absolutely flawed housing system in this country. And there are a number of things you have to do, from building more social housing to possibly more controversially private sector rent controls. There's a whole range of things you can do to make the situation fairer. But at the moment, the fundamental problem is private landlordism is mostly an unsophisticated business. And that's the critical reason why you need to have a good agent, because the agents have to adopt a degree of professionalism that's above that of most landlords because of the scale of what they do. And that's to my mind, the single best reason for having an agent to help that. The more you make this about a landlord against the tenant dispute, I think the more you miss the fundamental problem, which is the housing market, at least in the southeast of England, and I suspect other major cities, is just structurally flawed. And you need to have. I'm not advocating going back to the rent tax, because the problem with the rent tax, as you all know, is that the level of rent control got so strict that you couldn't make any money, so the properties fell into disrepair. But at the same time, the system we have at the moment, housing is used as a proxy for income stream for a certain class of society. And if you want that to be how our society is structured, then you've got to regulate it in a particular way. And I think for the players in that market, they've got to have agents. I mean, we all work in this. None of us can solve these problems. The advice we can give on both sides, to landlord and tenant at the moment, is, as I think we've all been saying throughout this, you don't really want to spend your time with lawyers at the moment, because we can't really help you. I mean, I can draft you a claim form as a landlord. I can draft you a disrepair defence as a tenant, and in a year's time, you might get in front of a judge. It doesn't really help anyone. I mean, I get paid, and that's great, and I like money, so I have no problem with getting paid. But that doesn't actually help anyone.
Don't solve it, does it? No.
In the short term, the way you solve it is discussions outside of court, trying to avoid spending time with lawyers. And you only really want to be going to court if there really is no other option. In the long term, you need a government that's prepared to grapple with the fact that housing is used as an asset in this country rather than as a means of providing housing. And if you think that's bad, and as you may have gathered, I do think that's bad, you need to work out how to reform the nature of the entire housing market. Just abolishing Section 21 won't achieve very much at all.
No.
If you leave other mandatory grounds in place, or if, as I suspect will happen, you abolish Section 21 but create more mandatory grounds, see what they did in Scotland by way of example. All that happens is to shift the fight from Section 21 to new Schedule 2A of the Housing Act 1988, or whatever they amended in. This isn't the sticking plaster territory. For the next year, people should be doing their darndest to avoid going to court, which is a weird thing for a lawyer to say, but they really should. They should be doing their darndest to avoid going anywhere near court. And over the next 5 years, you need a government prepared to grapple with the structure. I will not comment on whether that's likely or not.
You've hit. Do you know what, Justin? You've hit the nail on the head on so many points there, and that private rented sector that we're in is not fit for purpose. It's broken, and there seems to be more and more legislation and bits and pieces come in to try and fix it, but it's almost like you're just putting a band-aid over it. You're not actually stitching it up and sorting it out. I mean, you look at all of these, and rent control, like you said, it doesn't really work. But then you've
some of it does. The rent tax went a bit too far, but I mean, you can look, for example, at what Scotland's done with rent pressure zones. The threat that a local council could impose a rent control has had the effect of slowing rental growth. I mean, I'd be interested in looking a lot more at what Scotland does.
But that's the trouble, Justin. We just copy what Scotland does. I mean, they got rid of their section 21, which is section 33. They've now got the private rented tenancy. It's all, we do follow what Scotland does, but it's just getting something that's fit for purpose and in place. And I think, when they started taxing landlords, and like you say, it is a business for landlords, and you've got to accept losses and stuff. But like you say, you'll have landlords that have been served their country, right, and they put all their pension money into property because, like you say, it gets the best return. And they're also providing houses for people which wouldn't normally have houses. And with all of these bits and pieces that the government are implementing, it's deterring landlords. And this is why you say to a landlord, oh, guess what, we're going to abolish Section 21, we're going to put cap rents and that. First thing they're going to say is, I'm off, I'm out. This isn't what it used to be. I'm going to sell. And there's a lot of sales property on the market at the moment as well.
I'm fairly relaxed about that because the property doesn't go anywhere. The property doesn't go anywhere. But you started from the proposition that landlords provide housing. They don't. Landlords own housing and they let it. The provision of housing only comes from local authorities or private developers. Local authorities don't build because why would you with the right to buy? On what logical basis does any local authority build its own stock at the moment? And private developers, of course they build. Query quality of what they build, but the nature of what they build is much more for sale than for rent.
Yeah.
We just don't have any plan for creating a sustainable private rented sector. It's entirely ad hoc, it's entirely happenstantial, and I agree with you, and it's regulated in kind of a whack-a-mole approach. If a problem arises, let's insert new section 21 ZA7, because that will solve the problem.
Yeah.
You need to start and look again. I mean, I'm no fan of, for example, the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher, but the Housing Act 1980, regulating the entirety of the social rented sector, was an impressive piece of legislation, starting again. The Housing Act 88, whilst I'm no particular fan of it, is an impressive piece of legislation that was based upon a couple of years of research about what does the market need. You don't have anyone doing that research. You don't have a government at the moment that's interested in saying, right, what do we need the private rented sector to look like over the next 30 years, and how do we get there? What you have at the moment is a stock of property, some of which is owned by private landlords, some of which they sell, some of which gets built and then bought up by buy-to-let investors. You have a stash of property that's regulated in this ad hoc whack-a-mole kind of approach. That's fine for me. That means I do really well out of this. But housing shouldn't be about making lawyers money.
No.
That's what it does at the moment.
Well, it's about, and what I was alluding to before is providing homes for tenants that can't get on the ladder. You know, there's not this desire for home ownership that once was. I mean, a lot of the tenants we speak to, you know, they don't have a long-term plan of home ownership because they love the flexibility. If their landlord can repair the property when it needs it, and if their job changes, they can go and relocate to London or anywhere else.
Private renting, private renting should be an important part of what's provided.
Absolutely.
You shouldn't be driving people down the route of they have to buy.
No.
I mean, when people had rent act levels of security of tenure and rent act rent controls, it made no economic sense to buy because you could rent your home for your entire life. Right, we've gone for too long. I'm going to be quiet.
Yeah. I'm going to mute myself.
Other people want to talk, so I'm going to force myself to be quiet for 5 whole minutes.
No, it's really, really interesting. It was, but we try and bring it back to.
If you must.
Elizabeth, I didn't know whether you had anything further to add there in terms of any lessons you felt that could be learned by both landlords and tenants that possibly hasn't been covered yet.
Well, I've heard the passion in both David and Justin's voices, and I must say I agree wholeheartedly with where both of them are coming from, and very much what I think Justin said. We've got to remember what the purpose of housing is, and it's to provide somebody with a home. Understandably, landlords view it as potentially an investment, a source of income, a stream in that sense, but it's providing and fulfilling a fundamental purpose for somebody in terms of security and providing a roof over their heads. And just to bring back what really Carly and Paula said about communication, well, things will only ever work. And I remember Maureen Lipman in that BT ad where she said it's good to talk. It really is good to talk. It's important for parties just to try and corner a problem before it gets out of control. And so where, if possible, a payment plan could be set up, it's worthwhile taking the time to explore that possibility. And especially the likelihood of things getting to court very late in the day. Well, I think if it did, and a landlord said to the judge, well, we attempted a payment plan, it didn't work out, I've bent over backwards. Well, that's showing the landlord in a pretty good light. If the landlord is able to say, look, try to go in, try to address all the disrepair problems that there were in the property. I've kept a really good logbook. Here is my proof. Again, that stands a landlord in really good light. And also I find that it makes a tenant less antagonistic in terms of the steps that their landlord is taking if they have to ultimately recover possession. Whether most tenants I've come across recently are willing to surrender or to perhaps willingly give up their properties, they're being told mostly by local authorities not to do that because there's that threat of being deemed to be intentionally homeless if they are then going to go on and seek help. So I find that although they might be willing to try and help out their landlord in that way, they're being advised otherwise. And so there's also that consideration in terms of how to bring about a fruitful resolution of the situation. Usually, for me, it is communication. It really is.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the running theme throughout all of those discussions are that we want to do everything possible to avoid a court action, and really just opening those lines of communication as early as possible and taking steps at those stages to try and resolve any issues that might manifest then into far bigger disputes. That's really, really interesting. Thank you very much. I don't know whether anybody has got anything further they might want to add. We've had a couple of questions put forward, one of which I think has probably been covered off in some detail, but I'll run through it again. But I didn't know whether anybody else had any further comments just in conclusion of what's been discussed today.
I'm going to stay quiet because I'll just start ranting and getting on my high horse again.
Paula, did you have anything at all?
No, I think I've made it clear about communicating, and obviously we are dealing with the cases. So, you know, like Elizabeth has said, it is taking months. I've got a hearing listed for August that was issued in January. So, you know, just be aware of everything. When you're having an angry day with a tenant, just take a step back and talk to the tenant the next day.
Sure. Okay, well, we'll go into the questions that have been put forward. As I said, there's only a couple. So the first one is, and I'm not sure who will be best placed to direct this to, possibly David, but if a tenant won't allow people to enter the property for viewings during the pandemic, doesn't say why, but I guess maybe they're shielding, for example, the tenant is. What can a landlord do?
Not a great deal, because you know you've got in a tenancy agreement you've got the forfeiture clause and the landlord's got the right of re-entry, but let's not forget statute law. The tenant's got the right of quiet enjoyment, exclusive possession, which basically means they can exclude all others. So whatever's a lot of landlords believe I've got something written in my tenancy agreement, I can enforce it. Sometimes it can be an unfair clause, so we always go to statute law, and statute law currently would be protecting public health basically. So for a landlord, again, it's communication, work with your tenant, see when you can get in. I mean, say for example it's on the sales market, we have to adapt. I mean, we've got one at the moment which is a great example where the tenants, you know, have been a bit poorly for whatever reasons, they've had some bereavements, they don't want anyone in. We've served a section 21, but it's amicable, they understand. We've given them the 6 months notice. We said, look, if you find somewhere, you're free to go before that 6 month period. However, could we do a video tour? So they sent us a video of the property. We sent them pictures. The investor has brought it, but they won't complete until they see it. So everything's on hold because of that. And whilst, you know, we want to say to the tenant, come on, let us in, we can't really force that issue. If they don't want us in, you can't be seen to keep harassing them, because that relationship will then go sour. And then all of a sudden, for the rest of the term that they're in there, they might stop paying the rent, and you'll end up in court perhaps. So that, I hate to say it, it's a tough one for landlords.
Okay, and just changing that slightly then, if it wasn't for viewings, but say there was disrepair to the property,
Yeah.
and a contractor needed to get in,
Yeah.
what would the position be there?
Well, again, it's the same. The tenant has to allow that access lawfully. I mean, we have to access the property for repair issues. It's a landlord statutory obligation. But should there ever be a claim that goes to court, and like Paula said, they're doing a disrepair counter argument against it, at least we can evidence to say, well, actually, on the 26th of April, we wanted to send our gas safety engineer to do a gas safety report that was lawfully due. However, the tenant elected not to let them in. Now, I've had situations where I've kind of put a different spin on it, where a tenant said, I don't want the gas safety done because we're doing this, we're doing that. I said, okay, that's absolutely fine. We'll completely respect that. However, do take into account that you and your family are at risk. Should that gas safety not be done, you are putting your family at unnecessary risk if we don't get that done. So would you like to sign this disclaimer to state that you don't want anyone to get in? And then all of a sudden they said, you know what, we're going to go out for the day, let your guy go in, and do what he needs to do, and then that's it. So it's just about communicating and educating, I would say. It's just making people aware that if you don't do that, this is what could happen, but you've got every right to exclude us.
Fine, but if it does then end up at court, the landlord's got a defence there.
Absolutely.
If they can show that they have tried to gain entry.
Yeah. They've attempted and they've been, you know, stopped from getting access, so to speak. Yeah.
I should say that on disrepair claims, we get that a lot. They'll complain about disrepair, but actually refuse access or are really difficult in giving access. And, you know, there are genuine disrepair claims, and there are landlords that haven't dealt with things as quickly as possible, or agents that haven't supported in dealing with things as quickly as possible. But there are a lot of disrepair claims as a reason for not paying rent, but actually there's no real disrepair, or maybe minor, you know, no property is perfect. You're never going to walk into, certainly don't in my house, and everything's working perfectly as it should do at all times. You know, properties experience faults, they need to be fixed. And you know, you see these claims where they're complaining about very minor disrepair, or even, you know, major disrepair, but are refusing access, and it happens a lot. And I actually think that there's times where tenants think, you know what, that's not working. I'm actually quite happy to live with that if I cannot pay my rent, or I can pay less. Unfortunately, that's not all tenants. There are some genuine disrepair issues, but unfortunately that happens a lot. So keeping a record of your attempts to go in, being as reasonable as you can, making use of your agent to help you try and secure access. They know the tenants better than you do. They know what they do for jobs, for example. They may know that they work nights. You know, let's try and, you know, work around them, and have good contractors as well, that will keep a log of when they tried to go in, and what conversations they had with the tenant. You know, did they then speak to them the next day and try and go back in the next day? That all of that's really, really important to, unfortunately, protect yourself if you have to go to court on a, you know, to defend yourself against a disrepair claim. Absolutely. And avoid them altogether, you know, which is the main objective.
We're seeing that tenants actually getting expert reports early on, so you know, then defend the claim, so we know nothing about it, then we're suddenly hit with a report. Whereas it used to be, well, it still is the case with some cases, you agree an expert later on. So they're coming to us with expert reports. So
because they're relatively affordable to go and get an expert report. There's companies that will do a desktop, you know, survey for you now. You know, everybody's become better at working remotely, and they will do that, and they're, you know, they're fairly affordable, and they will kind of, you know, like you say, get their ducks in a row. But yeah, it's really important they communicate, and important they make a record of when they were notified and when they had knowledge, because I think that sometimes gets forgotten. If the landlord didn't have knowledge of it, and when not notified, then how could they deal with it? You know, and you know, a lot of tenants forget that. And then, you know, how could they have dealt with it if you didn't allow them in? And actually, again, what a lot of people don't, you know, deal with properly is it's not possible to get a contractor. I mean, at the moment, it's so difficult to get a contractor to do anything at the moment. What is reasonable amount of time? And, you know, it's not reasonable necessarily to get a gas or, you know, heating engineer to your property that same day. It's really, really difficult. So, you know, in the summer, if your heating's not working in, you know, for a day, couple of days, you know, what's, you know, it's very different to a landlord who's not bothering to send in a contractor when you've got no heating over in the winter. That's very, very different. So
it's trying to find a middle ground, isn't it? Because I have landlords who will say, well, I lived there before and it's absolutely fine. No, I don't mind the heating not working that well. And you think, no, that's not the same. And that goes back to the point that Justin makes, you know, these DIY landlords, you have to learn, you have to educate yourself. It's a business, you know? So it's, you know, a lot of mediation between the parties and trying to find some sort of middle ground.
It's worth saying, if you don't want to wear that extra jumper because it's cold in the house, that over the period of the pandemic, actually landlords have been allowed to enter properties to effect repairs. That has been one of the permissible reasons, especially gas safety. I mean, that's always been high on the list. So it's worthwhile, where a tenant's not shielding or there are other health reasons behind it, just to remind them that it's for their benefit that you're essentially going into the property. And definitely what Carly says, keep detailed logs of notification, when contractors go in and inspect, and then when the repairs are completed.
And most contractors, or when we've watched them on disrepair cases, we've said, can you tell us as well, because we need to tell the tenant what precautions you're going to take as a result of the pandemic, you know, and these contractors thought about it. They will be masked up. There will be not 3 of them. They'll do it if they can do it with 1 of them. They will go at certain times of the day. They'll wipe down after they finish, you know, that sort of thing. And if you've got, you know, particularly lettings agents, managing agents, if you've got a good bunch of contractors that you work with, it's much better.
Yeah.
It will take these things seriously and do a proper job.
Okay, thank you very much. And the second question that's been put forward, and as I said, I think this has probably been addressed in some detail, but if anyone's got anything further to add, then please do say. My tenant has lived in my property for over 5 years, however, recently has fallen into arrears due to being on furlough. What steps should I take to protect myself and ensure I get the outstanding rent back? Paula, did you want to jump in there? Again, I think it's probably been addressed in some detail.
Yeah, in short, to talk to the tenant and try and sit down and look at finances. So one thing I didn't add is that you can ask the tenant for their financial information. There's nothing wrong with that. So if they've said they've lost their job, ask for proof. Ask them to fill in like a means questionnaire, just setting out what their outgoings are and their income, and try and find a figure that works for the arrears to be paid over a certain amount of time. Or if the landlord is in a better position, consider a rent reduction, but it's making it very clear, you know, perhaps writing those arrears off, making it very clear to the tenant that this is a one-off, because then you know, the risk is the tenant falls into bad habits and expects the landlord to just be a pushover. So yeah, just sit down with the tenant, look at all the finances, or even ask the tenant can go to the CAB. There is assistance out there to help them come to a repayment plan. Forward it to the landlord and get it agreed in writing, and review it each month. That's what I landlords just keep checking in.
The only thing I would add to that is just whilst you're doing that, it's a, you know, two-pronged approach. I would make sure you've got everything in order and protect your position if that doesn't work. So like Paula said before, that's running in the background. So do your homework there, get advice early, and make sure that if unfortunately if you do need to serve a notice, perhaps you serve it whilst you do that, and make it really clear that if you can resolve it, you absolutely will, but you've got that notice served and your paperwork in order, so that unfortunately if you have to proceed, you can much quicker.
Thank you very much. Well, that's the end of the questions that have been put forward as well. So I think we've covered off everything that we wanted to within that discussion, and probably some more as well, which is great. But I think, as I've already said, the key themes that have run through most of it are for those lines of communication to be opened as early as possible, for people to be reasonable, and for expectations to be managed from an early stage to try and stop anything going to court, because there's obviously severe delays at this time and it doesn't benefit anybody at the moment by going down that route. So thank you all very much for your time. Really do appreciate it. It was very informative and really interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you later.